assault on universality, on the general norms of human rights protection started in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the most, I think, most recent and egregious example of that is what happened in Tehran at early September of a month and a half ago. There was a conference of the non-aligned movement held in Tehran, and the UN High Commissioner Louise Arbour went to Tehran, sat in the front row, listened to Ahmadinejad rail against the Zionist regime and the United States. And she gave her own speech. The highest person at the United Nations tasked with implementing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights said, universal human rights are the preeminent vehicle for the promotion in a contextually sensitive way of the commonality of human needs and aspirations. And she also said, universality, therefore, need not be considered in an inflexible and rigid manner. So what did Iran think about that? Well, the day after she left, they executed 21 people and strung them up in public places from cranes. The July, they stoned somebody to death for alleged adultery. That's what they mean by cultural sensitivity in Iran. So she would have known that her words in that place at this moment in time would have been misconstrued in a way which threatens the whole concept of the protection of human rights. Now, that leads me to the question of, well, why? Why is this happening anyway? Basically, I call it doing the math. The United Nations has 192 members. 117 of them belong to the non-aligned movement, so-called non-aligned movement. It's aligned against the United States in most everything Western democracies stand for. But the largest single voting bloc in the non-aligned movement is the Organization of the Islamic Conference, 56 members. They call it 57 because they say Palestine is a country. Largest single voting bloc in the group with the majority of countries in the United Nations. Take the Human Rights Council of the UN. It has 47 members. The majority of seats are held, or votes are held, by the African and Asian regional group, and the OIC holds a majority of seats within the Asian and African regional groups. So they control everything that goes on at the Human Rights Council. It isn't a surprise. They want a vote, they get a vote, that's the end of the discussion. So it's important to understand that this is strictly a matter of numbers, a game which we cannot win at the United Nations. The question has to be asked, how genuine is this concern with human rights violations against Muslims? Well, 70% of all the resolutions ever adopted at the Human Rights Council in its first year and a half of operation, coming on the heels of the so-called reform of the UN Human Rights Commission, are about Israel. Nothing on honor killings against Muslim women, nothing against suicide bombers killing thousands of Muslims in Iraq, nothing on stoning of Muslim women under the criminal code in so many Muslim states, nothing about public executions in Iran, nothing about systematic torture in Egypt. So are they serious about their concern for human rights violations against Muslims? No. The only time that they feign this kind of consideration is when the perpetrator is non-Muslim or alleged perpetrator. There hasn't been a single resolution on genocide in Sudan, on anything in Sudan, directed at the human rights violations in Sudan, in the General Assembly for the last 5 years, though the victims are Muslim. There are, however, 22 resolutions on Israel. It's also interesting to note that of 2006, in the last 4 years, the top most criticized UN member states for human rights violations across the UN system, number 1, Israel, number 2, Sudan, number 3, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and number 4, the United States of America. Of all the subsidiary bodies of the UN General Assembly, there are 6 on Palestinians, none on any other specific people on earth. So the concern for human rights is what you might say highly selective. Where does this leave us? This is, as I say, not idle chit-chat. With respect to terrorism, there is no definition of the United Nations of terrorism. On the contrary, on October the 10th, the non-aligned movement made the following speech at the United Nations. We call for the definition of terrorism to differentiate it from the legitimate struggle of peoples under colonial or alien domination and foreign occupation for self-determination and national liberation. The brutalization of peoples kept under foreign occupation is the gravest form of terrorism. So what do they mean by that? They mean killing Americans and Israelis is not terrorism. The Organization of the Islamic Conference said, We reaffirm that to resolve outstanding issues related to the legal definition of terrorism, particularly on the distinction between terrorism and people's struggle for self-determination against foreign occupation. So, for as far as they're concerned, this assault on the human rights system directly relates to legitimizing terrorism. And one, for example, can point to the many letters of the Palestinian UN ambassador to the Security Council where he calls suicide killers routinely martyrs. So martyrdom has become another UN category which is taking hold. These two things go hand in hand. If you can paint yourself a victim, if you can claim the other guy is the human rights violator, if you become the victim of racism and Islamophobia, then you justify the so-called struggle against the enemy of human rights. As Pakistan said, terrorist acts carried out by non-state actors in the name of religion should be de-linked from religion. So, we're going to pretend that terrorism, even though it's done in the name of religion, has nothing to do with religion. Pakistan continues, the international community must address the root causes of terrorism. What are they? Such as the repression against Muslims. So we're going to turn every Muslim everywhere as subject to discrimination. You know, countries with their terrific record of freedom of expression went on to talk about freedom of opinion has been utilized to humiliate Islam, cause hatred, instigate violence. So we no longer know whether there are universal standards, what they are, who's a victim, who's a perpetrator. The idea is to confuse the enemy and then ultimately to excuse terrorism. And I think that the biggest UN lie of all, again as the OIC says, is that the international media continues to use the misguided actions of a small extremist minority as an excuse to malign the entire Muslim world as well as the religion of Islam. The international community must address the root causes of terrorism, such as repression against Muslims. So it leaves us in a situation where the irony is that in the very states in which there is no freedom of religion, bear in mind, freedom of religion is now used by these countries to have the audacity to become their calling card. And we're faced with an assault which begins with the war of ideas but ends with the potential to repeat.